Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 4 game from the Marshall Premier. Now, if you followed the round 3 video, you know that I drew a tough game with black against Brandon Jacobson, and I was basically very alert there and in danger of being seriously worse, but managed to sack a pawn for compensation and kind of rode that wave to a draw. Now, with 2.5 out of 3 in this weekend event, I knew I was going to be playing another strong player, and it was not a huge surprise to me when I discovered I'd be playing against Grandmaster Djurabek Khamrakulov. Djurabek is originally a player from Uzbekistan, I believe, but has been living in New York for some time as a coach and player himself. So he's been on New York City chess scene quite a bit, and you will see him from time to time competing at the Marshall. So it's actually not the first time I've played him this year, and it's actually not the last either. So anyways, I was white in this one, and I was hoping to get some pressure on him after the double black that I'd gotten in rounds 2 and 3. This is my first white game in a minute, and yeah, let's see what happens. So anyways, I went for d4. Djurabek played knight f6. He typically, with black against e4, is a Caro-Kann or Scandinavian player. And against d4, he usually goes for the Nimzo or the Queen's Gambit decline. So he's a very classically inclined player. But also, even with that classical grounding, he's actually very tricky and slippery. And I've seen him play a lot of positions where he somehow wriggles out somehow and gets a win where he shouldn't, or gets a draw where he should have lost. And the slippery nature of his play is backed up by really solid openings. So he's a really tough opponent to beat. But anyways, I was hoping to get a position in the Nimzo because I'd had some experience with that recently. As you've seen, my Queen C2 Nimzo has been, getting decent results, and I was angling for that type of position to attack his Nimzo. So I went for C4, and then he actually went E6. And after Knight C3 and Bishop B4, I actually got what I wanted when I played the move Queen C2, opting for the classical Nimzo. And this is a position you've seen me now play quite a few times. I played it in round 1 of this event. I'd also played it in the last round, in round 9 of the Luneburg Chess Festival. And in both those events, I had promising positions. And so it's something I'm quite comfortable with. Now, thus far, I had seen castles and d5 as options in the position. But this time, my opponent actually played the move c5. And this move is not as common as the other moves, in part because it's a little bit more dynamic. Maybe you can argue a little bit riskier in some respects, but it's actually was a move that was quite popular in the 80s and the 90s. And I mean, it's still played quite a bit, just not as popular as some of the more solid options with castles and d5. The idea here is that a3 is actually not a really great move, because if you play a3 right away, black is now comfortable taking on c3 and then actually taking on d4. And the issue here is that after a move like knight c6, the queen is just chased around a little bit too much to justify the bishop pair, and black can already break in the middle with d5. So let's say I play a move like queen c3. Now d5, and already d4 is a threat. Black is obviously seriously more developed, and so actually playing a3 right away after c5 is really a no-go, and you have to kind of deal with this pawn tension in the center. So after c5, I actually went d takes c5. This is the main move, trying to resolve that tension. And after in this position, black actually castled, but you can see the position is actually different than most in the Queen C2 Nimzo. And part of the concept is that, even though white released the tension in the center, he's probably not going to even get the 2 bishops, because after a3, black can actually recapture on c5 and not take the knight. The argument is that the d pawn on d7 is actually slightly backward because of the pawn on c4, and white typically tries to play on the d file and get compensation for that pawn. So the arrows I'm drawing now with knight f3, bishop g5, rook d1, those are all moves that are typify this structure against the d7 pawn, basically setting up your pieces to play along the half-open d file. So anyways, after castles, the main move is actually a3, and this is a move I actually did not know at the time. It's a little bit smarter to play a3 right away, just to coax the bishop into capturing on c5, because the move I played, knight f3, actually allows black additional options. And, Khamrakulov actually used this in his favor by playing the move knight a6. And the point is that if black doesn't have to take the pawn on c5 with this bishop, and he can instead develop the knight to c5 and take like that, that's actually quite a good decision. And the benefit of actually recapturing with the knight also is that you have more control over the e4 square, which is a square that typically black actually lacks control of. So it's actually quite a decent decision to play knight a6. I now played e3, kind of recognizing that, a3 probably wasn't so hot anymore. But the issue with not going for this a3 and b4 move, which is, again, typical in this structure, is that now my bishop actually gets on the wrong diagonal. So the diagonal it prefers to be on is typically the b2 h8 diagonal. But here after e3, if my bishop goes to d2, it's really not a very active bishop. So this, again, is the reason why a3 right away is more promising, because in many positions, white will eventually play for b4 and then put the bishop on b2. Anyway, so after knight f3, knight a6, and e3, black now took on c5 with the knight. And I can get the bishop pair whenever I want with a3, but it's not so attractive to rush that move anymore, because if I do play a3, after this exchange, black can actually go a5 and discourage my knight, discourage me from kicking the knight away, because he might have some squares like a4 and maybe even b3 at some point. And he also has the e4 square to play with. So here, actually playing a3 and weakening my light squares even more seemed like a bad idea, especially when I was already a little undeveloped. So instead, I played the very modest-looking bishop d2, and was not thrilled with my setup because, again, these black knights have good control over e4 already. I'm not castled, black is, and it just seemed like black got everything he wanted from the opening. Now, after bishop d2, black played d6, which is a normal move, just putting the bishop on, putting the pawn on d6, potentially entertaining b6 and bishop b7 later. Really solid move. Just getting almost like a hedgehog type of position, except the bishop is on b4 instead of on e7. After d6, I win bishop e2. I'm essentially very hastily trying to castle kingside, because that's pretty much the priority now. And now black actually made a move that I believe to be a mistake and the engines agree with, and it's the move e5. And the reason e5 is a mistake is because of the square I've highlighted, the d5 square. It was actually completely unnecessary to weaken this d5 point. And yeah, I mean, although he is taking some space in the center and he's covering the d4 square, I just didn't think this was necessary. It might give me a potential target in the future. Instead, a move like b6 would have been, comfortably more reliable. You basically are, revving up to put the bishop on b7. You continue to get excellent control of the e4 square. And again, white will secure the bishop on b4 at some point with a3, but it's not necessarily a move that white is thrilled about making, because he weakens the b3 square. So, yeah, b6 would have been a little bit more solid. Instead, after e5, I at least have something to chew on a little bit later. And here I castled, fully thinking that, now maybe I can take advantage of knight d5 at some point. Now, I don't want to rush with knight d5, because if I do, then after he recaptures on d5, my pawn would occupy the square. And the square is only a weakness as long as I'm controlling it, but not occupying it. So it's very important that I don't play c takes d5, because then the square wouldn't actually be a weakness anymore. And in fact, the pawn might be a liability for me on that point. So did not want to play c takes d5, but just wanted to kind of eye that square. And as long as the half-open d file is like that, I actually want to pressure the d6 pawn. So that's the other reason why I don't want to rush with knight d5. So anyways, after castles, black played bishop g4, and I think this is essentially his idea, was that by playing the move e5, I'm not exactly in position to play knight d4, and this pin against my e2 bishop is actually kind of annoying, because it means that I have to be, at least aware of that, of this bishop potentially taking that knight on f3 if my bishop on e2 moves away. And I'm also not particularly enthusiastic about trading the light squared bishops, because then maybe some of my light squares I might not have as good coverage over, particularly d3 and e4. So bishop g4 is reasonable and is at least consistent with the plan that he went for with e5. I now played rook d1, rook f d1, and my idea was to get my rook lined up against this backward d6 pawn and to just also eye the d5 square. But you can ask yourself, why did the rook f rook go to d1 instead of the a rook to d1? Well, you'll see why in a minute, but why don't you think about that question for yourself? Because I think it's actually a very, very, interesting question about which rook to place there. And I think I actually proceeded with the right one, but think about why that's the case. So, anyways, after rook f d1, Black now went bishop h5, and I think that was the other continuation of his plan. And something that I had actually realized is that this bishop can actually reroute itself very nicely to g6, from which it eyes a very, very important diagonal. Note that, again, the d3 square is sensitive, the e4 square is sensitive, and my queen really lacks squares going forward, so I'm really relegated to the back rank, and that's not really something I want. The other thing is, playing e4 is not very desirable because at any moment, Black can take on c3 and then recapture on e4. So I really don't want to play this e4 move, and so bishop g6 is quite a serious move, and I have to make a tough decision. In this position, I decide to play the move bishop e1. And now I think maybe you can understand why the move rook f d1 was played, is because I actually was anticipating this maneuver with bishop g4, bishop h5, and bishop g6. And it was very, very important to me that I got my rooks connected in a scenario like that, and also having my bishops tucked away on e1 and e2 enabled me to basically play on the d and c files without the bishops getting in the way. So I thought rook f d1 was very important. Again, in the same variation, if we go rook a d1, bishop h5, and bishop e1, the bishop on e1 is actually getting in the way of the rook on f1, and this is not a very nice harmonious position. So I think my move order was correct. Anyways, after rook f d1, bishop h5, and bishop e1, I actually could have done something instead of bishop e1. The computer actually is in favor of the move knight b5. And this is a move I did not seriously consider at this juncture, but the point is that now that my rook is on d1, I can actually get the bishops off the board. And after bishop g6 and queen c1, these bishops still come off the board. And after a subsequent exchange, I actually have a lot of pressure on the d6 pawn. Now, this is defensible. Black can actually go knight f e4 and attack my queen. But I can just move my queen away to b4, and there's still pressure on the d6 pawn. Note that if a move like h6 is played, knight takes d6 is just winning a pawn with interest, because after knight takes d6, queen takes d5, white is certainly for choice here with this pin on the d6 knight. So basically, because of that pressure on the d6 pawn and on these knights, Black would need to step out the way with a move like queen b6, which pins the knight on b5 to the queen on b4, and prevents me from playing knight takes d6. But here I can actually play a3, and my queen is actually protected, and now I'm reinforcing this knight takes d6 threat. And after rook f d8, Black would be defending that pawn, but white would actually still have a slight advantage here, again, based upon this backward pawn on d6. So this is actually something that I could have gone for. I did not, but definitely another option in the position. So anyways, after bishop e1, Black actually took on c3, but just to give you a sense of, if bishop g6 here, now I actually have a few options, but the one I was going to angle for is actually just queen c1. And the point is that I'm actually threatening knight takes e5 in this position because the rook is lined up against the queen on d8. And I actually still have knight b5 in reserve. So the bishops here are still kind of opposing each other, and I do have that option, but knight takes e5 is also kind of annoying. And I think white actually is fine here, and as soon as the queen moves off the back rank, these rooks will be connected. So it's really just a temporary inconvenience. After bishop takes c3, I played queen takes c3, just getting that bishop pair, and I actually felt pretty good here because I have the bishop pair. E4 doesn't win material because I have knight d4, which protects the bishop on e2, and the d6 pawn is still backward. So I thought that basically those features in the position should get me an advantage as long as I'm able to weather the short-term storm of black controlling the e4 square and having these knights kind of clamping up the center. So I did recognize that I don't have the most amazing foothold in the center just yet, but I thought that the two bishops here tucked back on e1 and e2 would justify my setup. So after queen takes c3, black actually went a5, and that's actually the reason why Djurabek actually took on c3 right away, because it was actually a little bit puzzling to me that after bishop e1, he voluntarily gave up the bishop pair. I mean, you might say, well, why didn't he go a5 here and maybe take after a3? The point is, again, that I would have this knight b5 move. And here it's actually even better because now the knight on b5 is unassailable. A pawn on a5 can never challenge the knight on b5. And, the d6 pawn and the e5 pawn are targets. Whereas by taking right away, he actually ensures that knight b5 is not a move. But now, because I've played queen takes c3, b4 is an idea, so he has to stop that and play a5. Now, the question here is how to proceed, because essentially I have a scenario in the center where my pawn in c4 is doing a good job of controlling d5, but my pawn in e3 is just kind of restricted because the knights are doing a great job of controlling the e4 square. And I also don't want to just rush with b4 to challenge the knight because all of a sudden I'm further shattering my queenside pawn structure. And again, now the black knight on c5 has a wonderful outpost for the rest of the game. So I have to be very careful here about how I proceed because black is kind of, putting on the screws, so to speak, with my pawn breaks. And so I thought for a while here about what was the best way to kind of get my pawn breaks off. And I played the move b3. And I thought this was a really, really clever move and really well played. And the point is that in the long term, I actually would love to play a3 and b4. But I can't rush with this a3 move because now black plays a4. And now my b4 pawn is... my b2 pawn is backward, and b4 is probably never going to happen because of this en passant with a takes b3. So by playing b3, I'm slowly entertaining the idea of a3 and b4 later without doing permanent harm to my structure. The other thing is I kind of fixed the a5 pawn in a dark square, and I do have this bishop on e1, which may target it in the future. So even if I decide not to play a3 and b4, my pawn structure right now is actually quite compact. So, yeah, pretty decent for white. So after b3, black went queen b6, again trying to clamp down on my a3 b4 idea and that eventual break, and that's a good decision. Also getting the queen out of the line of the rook on d1. If my bishop on e2 was protected, I was going to have knight takes e5 as an option just to take advantage of the queen on d8, so that also makes a ton of sense. After queen b6, I played rook b1. And my idea here was, again, to kind of reinforce the notion that a3 and b4 is a possibility, but also, frankly, to consider lines where maybe my rook would even transfer to the second rank and double the rooks, because I'm pretty much inviting the bishop to come to g6 and harass my rook on b1. But I thought that, with the rook on the b file, I could go to b2 if bishop g6 is played. And I'm also discouraging a4 because my rook is already lined up against the queen. So I could play b4 and support the pawn further, or I could play b takes a4 and attack the queen on b6. So after rook b1, black actually played rook fc8, which is a very dangerous move for me, lining the rook up against my queen on c3. And you can see here my queen is lacking some squares. I mean, if I go to d2, then knight e4 is kind of annoying. If I go to b2, it's a little bit passive. If I go to c2, bishop g6 skewers my queen and my rook. And if I go to c1, well, it's still on the line of the rook on c8. So I have to be very careful here. And it's not an easy decision to make, but I decided to play the move queen d2 anyway. And the reason I decided to play queen d2 is I thought by attacking the d6 pawn with tempo, I'm at least forcing black to make a decision. And I thought that if black actually did move the knight to e4, now I would actually go queen b2, and I'd argue that the knight on e4 is not super well placed. It might be a potential target for my pieces later, and it's just not as compact as it would be on f6. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'm happy to provoke knight fe4. It turns out in this position that the move the computer really likes is actually queen b2. This move I did not really like very much because of the move bishop g6, as I noted, challenging the rook on b1. And what I was concerned about was that after rook bc1, that a4 would be an annoying move to face, because all of a sudden there are 3 attackers on this pawn and only 2 defenders, and it appears that I can't defend it with another piece efficiently. So, but it actually turns out here that the best move after a4 is actually to play b4. And again, I saw this move, but I really did not like the fact that there was this a3 in between move, which essentially robbed my a pawn on a2 of being connected to the pawn on b4. Of course, if this knight moves away, and now I play a3, I'm an extremely happy camper because these pawns are connected. a4 is going to be a weakness later, and it seems like I'm getting good control. And the knight on that was on c5 does not have that secure outpost anymore. But I just did not like this a3 move because now my queen actually has to go to a1. And I thought that a position like this, with the a pawn being so far advanced, with the bishop controlling the b1 square, stuff like knight a4 really concerned me. I thought that knight b2 might be an idea. I thought that maybe, just this queen is getting boxed out. It turns out that my bishops on e1 and e2 are, doing a great job of controlling the fort. And I can actually consider playing a move like c5 to break open the structure on the e5 pawn. But I just did not like my queen sitting in the corner and on a1 like this. It just seemed very, very awkward. So instead, I opted for queen d2. After queen d2, black went bishop g6 anyway, challenging my rook. But here I can play rook b2, and this is the point, is that now that my queen is not on that square, my rook has the square, and I thought this made a pretty significant difference. The other thing here is that a4 is no longer as attractive as in the previous variations because now the d6 pawn is actually just hanging. So, basically black has to address that before playing a4. And so after rook b2, black played rook d8 to defend that pawn. But this is kind of a small victory because basically this rook went to c8 and now it went back to d8. So, okay, I'm cool with that. And now my rooks are split for now, but they might be coordinated in the future. So now after rook d8, I went knight h4, and this was another critical idea of my plan of actually drawing out this bishop to g6, is because my knight on f3 was a problem piece for most of the early middle game. It couldn't go to d4. It was not really doing anything, eyeing the e5 pawn, and it was very, very restricted. And now the knight h4 is an excellent purpose, trying to get rid of the bishop. And if I'm able to get rid of this bishop on g6, all of a sudden my queen could slide over to c2 or c1, and the pressure on this diagonal would diminish. So I thought this was a really nice opportunity for me because now it seems like I'm getting closer to getting the bishop pair, which we know is, well, I already have the bishop pair, but also getting 2 bishops for 2 knights I thought is a serious asset for white and would give me excellent long-term chances. After knight h4, black actually played d5 now, liberating that backward pawn and trying to create a crisis in the middle while I'm still not quite coordinated with this awkward rook on b2 and the queen on d2. And this is probably one of the critical positions of the game because it seems like everything's going to just blow up in a little bit. I played the move knight takes g6 after probably too long of a thought. One of the things that I was worried about here was actually not the recapture, but was actually d takes c4 first. Strange looking move, I know, but I think I was just worried about this in-between move, disturbing my queen and rook. It turns out here I can just go knight e7 check, and after king f8, go queen c1. And the exchange on d1 was what I worried about. I was concerned that after queen takes d1, my rook on b2 would be lacking coverage, and I thought a move like c takes b3 might be a possibility here, sacking a piece because my knight doesn't have a lot of squares. But it turns out this is total rubbish. I can just go knight d5, for instance, trade my piece, my extra piece, and the bishop's here, and the rook control these pawns effectively on the queen side. So this line is just rubbish, and basically he would have to take the piece, and then after bishop takes c4, the king on e7 is not as resilient as it would be on g8. Actually, it's more vulnerable here. I still have the two bishops. My rook can swing over to d2 now. White is better. So I spent a little bit too much time before taking on g6, and much to my dismay, after knight takes g6, h takes g6 was played almost instantly. So I was like, wow, I spent like 20 or 30 minutes just profoundly wasting time. Not very profoundly. Just wasting time for a scenario that was very unlikely. And this is probably time I could have got back a little bit later, because now after c takes d5, I played this because I did not want to allow d4. So I played c takes d5, and after knight takes d5, I was really coming up on some time trouble, and black does have some threats. Even though black has the knight pair instead of the bishop pair, knight b4, or maybe even knight f4 is an idea, and these discoveries are not pleasant against my queen on d2. So I played queen c1 to get out of the way of that those discoveries, and now Djurabek played knight b4. And I thought here, okay, we're getting closer to this endgame that I wanted, where I have these long-term trumps of the two bishops. But actually, after my move rook bd2, which was the best move in the position, and then this exchange on d2, it kind of dawned on me here that black is extremely active, and that after black's next move, it would be very, very difficult for me to kind of control all of the energy in the position. And so I kind of resigned to the understanding that, this is not just a, completely winning position for me. It actually is not clear at all, and it's in large part because of black's next move. Why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out what black's next move is? All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what black's move is that really does more or less equalize the game. And it's the move e4. And the point is, actually, I'm thinking that I'm going to just have this wonderful play on the d file. My bishops are going to be unscathed coming to c4 and c3. But unfortunately for me, one of these knights is going to be stuck on d3, and it's really going to be difficult to neutralize the pressure with the knight there. First of all, my rook would be blocked on the file, and my bishops would be very limited. So I have to be very careful of not allowing this wedge to just stay there, because then all of a sudden black can take the initiative. So after e4, I thought for a while trying to figure out, is there anything I could do against this? But I figured I really should not allow a knight to cement itself on d3, and that's why I played the move a3. Now, there were some alternatives, but they actually all lead to kind of equality, so I will show you the alternatives before proceeding with the game. One candidate was actually bishop c4, just getting the bishop to this diagonal before the knight comes to d3. But even here, knight b d3 is pretty annoying, because my remaining bishop on e1 is kind of, a goner, and my queen and rook are blocked on the file, so that's very annoying. I could play h3 here just to give myself an escape square, but after queen d6, black is starting to consolidate, eyeing the d3 knight, can reinforce with rook d8, and I don't really have an advantage here. Another try was queen d4, which is a little bit better, because essentially now if you try to put a knight on d3, you actually lose a pawn, because after bishop takes d3, e takes d3, and rook takes d3, all of a sudden the knight on c5 is actually pinned to the queen on b6, so you can't take my rook. And so you can't actually play the knight to d3, but you can play the move knight c2. And this fork actually ensures that black gets rid of one of my bishops, and after queen c4, knight takes e1, and rook takes e1, black also gets to play rook d8 and take control of the open file. So this type of position also gives black very, very active play, and he's really not very much worse, if at all. So, yeah. So I basically tried to play a3 because in this particular position, I thought the knight can't put itself on d3. But now knight takes b3 is allowed. Basically, if you go knight d3 now, I could play the move b4. And this move dislodges the knight on c5 and allows me to recapture the one on d3. For instance, if you go ab, ab, this knight has to move. And if you go knight e1, that's actually losing because I play b takes c5. So the knight would have to go somewhere. Then I could take on d3. And this type of position is better for white, because if you go knight takes b4, that actually loses on the spot, I believe, to queen b3. And the issue is that the knight is just dropping, and knight d5 does not save matters because the queen also controls that square. So yeah, I did have an idea behind it, but I am offering up the b3 pawn, and so Djurabek gobbled that up with knight takes b3, and he's not actually getting to the d3 square as cleanly as he would have liked, but he liquidates material, and that actually helps him draw the game, because now I played the move queen b2, challenging the knight on b3. It does not have a square to go to, because if you go to d4, I can take it, and if you go to c5, I can play a takes b4 and get the other knight. So both knights are attacked. But black has the saving grace knight d3. And the point is, I can play bishop takes d3. After e takes d3, rook takes d3, I recover my pawn. But black is actually, quite active here, and trading one of my pawns gave him actually the pawn majority on the queen side, so I have to be a little bit alert. But I do have the bishop for the knight, but black is actually a little bit too solid for me to seriously entertain winning this game. After rook takes d3, black played a4 here, and I went queen c2, essentially trying to just control the c and d files. And I thought here I might have a symbolic advantage because my bishop could come to b4. My queens and rooks are on active files. Oops, that arrow was bad, but my queens and rooks on active files. My bishop comes to b4. It seems like the knight isn't so active. But now Djurabek played the move queen e6 and offered me a draw. And I realized here that my control of the c file was actually going away, because now all of a sudden rook c8 is a threat. And the other issue with rook c8 is that you hit my queen and you actually entertain infiltrating with rook c1. So now it was actually quite clear to me that I don't have control of the c file permanently. And if I don't have control of the c file, I probably don't have an advantage. And so in this position, I actually agreed to a draw. Now, I could have tried to play on. One way I could try is to go queen d1. And now if rook c8, I can go rook d8 check and trade the queens. But it's just very, very unrealistic to think that I'm going to win this one. I could try. I could go bishop. I could go h3, give myself an escape square, go bishop b4 to protect my b pawn. But black's knight can hop around and generate some counterplay against my king. And I just did not see it. And given the fact that I was actually quite low on time because I'd burned a lot of time on this knight takes g6 move a little while ago, I thought that after queen e6, it was kind of more responsible to take the draw and to live to fight another day, because it meant that I was still going to be tied for first place. So I agreed to the draw here. I got to 3 out of 4 because I had 2 wins and 2 draws in my last 2 games. And 1 round to go, I was still in it, so to speak. So I thought that was the way to go, and that's what I did. Interesting game, I think, just from a first of all, a theoretical standpoint with the queen c2 Nimzo. I definitely learned my lesson here about playing a3 before developing, because if I really want the bishop on b4 to capture the pawn on c5 and not this knight that swung around from a6 to c5. So definitely something to think about there. And then I think later on in the game, I untangled really, really well, but it took me a little bit too long to do so, and black got enough counterplay in the middle to offset the bishop pair. So, kudos to him. He's a good player. He's a grandmaster after all, and they don't make it easy. So, anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.